I'm a screen share. We're going to get started here. And I think you can see my one OneNote display of Romans. It's getting kind of messy, all this work that we've done. I may do some diagramming today just to layer things a little bit, give us some distance. But I'm actually very excited about this content that's coming up because I think it we're getting to the core of what Paul wants to convey in what's called a thesis statement. And I think I can maybe convince you of that, at least get you to think about it. And then I'll show some larger structural things, how these verses 14, 16, 17 prepare for what comes. And so part of what we're doing when we're looking at Paul, looking at the Greek text, is we have to pay attention to discourse structuring, seams, transitions, generalized statements, summarizing statements. Inductive Bible study that we teach at Asbury can train one to do that pretty well, if you can grow in that understanding. So yeah, let's just go ahead and jump in. I think we stopped at 13. I think I might have suggested that 13 is a transition is taking place here. He is giving a disclosure statement. I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers. So thelo de umas agnoin adelphi oti polakis pro themein elthin pros umas ke ekolo ekolu thein arcri tu devro inatina carpons go ke en umin kathos ke entis lupus ethnicin. All right, I'm not a real good reader. That's okay. I do other things well, but I don't read really well. And some days it just kind of flows, and today it felt like I was struggling a bit. Okay, so one thing that we got to see right away is that there is a de. Okay, so this is marking new development. We have a thelo, which is I don't want. Thelo is to want. I don't want. And then with this verb, we're typically looking for an infinitive. Now that to complete its meaning, that infinitive is agnoin. Agnoin is a present active infinitive from agnoeo, to be ignorant. So I don't want you to be ignorant. I mean, you could have just said, I want you to know something. But when he says, I don't want you to be ignorant, it entails a literary device known as litotes, which is the denial of the negative of something. So when you deny the negative of something, you're actually advocating for the positive. So yeah, so this is an interesting statement. It is formulaic. It is formulaic, and Quintilian the rhetorician, writing at the end of the first century, uses this as an example of how you can start a narrative to inform somebody of something that they need to know. And so I think we are looking at narrative material here, maybe the start of narrative material. Although if we look at the um, the previous verse, we also have um, narrative topics, and that is appealing to witnesses. And we also have a past tense orientation that Paul's been saying, look, I've been praying for you. I long to see you. And so I think that this material is kind of whetting goodwill feeling, which you're supposed to do at the beginning of talks, is to establish goodwill, as well as to say, here's the background. I want you to know. I've been wanting to come to you. I've been praying for you, been wanting to come to you. And so the other thing that's interesting about Paul's praying, and this is the point I didn't make last time, is that Paul often begins with prayer and thanksgiving. And what I've begun to notice about his prayers and thanksgiving is that often the content of that prayer and thanksgiving relates materially to the content of the letter. And it's not always and often a thesis statement, which also, prepares for what comes in a more specific way. But I find it intriguing that Paul records what he's been praying about. And then in the letter, he discloses what he's been praying about. And I find that there's kind of an interesting relationship between praying and then the realization of that prayer. Something real similar to this occurs in Matthew, the transition from chapter 9 to 10, where Jesus says, hey, disciples, the harvest is great. Pray for the Lord of the harvest to send out harvesters. And then Jesus sends them out in the next chapter. So we need to be careful what we pray for, in the sense that it prepares us for the realization of the prayer. We need to recognize that prayer is almost like getting ready to putting the clutch down as we put the car into gear. And of course, you have to understand how to drive manual to understand that analogy. But prayer is really a preparation for the engagement of what follows. And I think when we when we devote ourselves to the Lord and give ourselves to praying, being open and mindful of promptings and what's on our heart, that there's a preparation that is happening there. So I find it interesting that in Paul's letters, he is praying for them, and then the things that he's praying for are realized in the giving of the letter. It's like his praying is preparing him for what is going to be written about in the letter. Now, if this obtains for Romans, we might have some clue as to what is this spiritual gift. He wants to impart some spiritual gift to them. And I've been teaching through Romans exegesis class. We're using Richard Longenecker's commentary, very fine commentary, and I think he's right. He suggests that the spiritual gift is Paul's understanding of the gospel, which is going to be written about in Romans, which is going to be the focus of the thesis statement that we're going to be seeing in verse 14 following. So just a little precursor that we do have a past tense orientation. Paul has been praying. This prayer has to do with imparting some spiritual gift when he's with them. This letter is preparing for that, and it's disclosing his understanding of the gospel. So I see a question. Yeah, that's a good question, Mark. Outside the New Testament, is there any rhetorical study on use of prayer and thanksgiving letters of the period? Not that I am aware of. I mean, there's been a lot of epistolary kind of analysis. Merging epistolary and rhetoric isn't always a happy one. The book that I use for my doctoral students, my seminar for postgraduate students is Hans Josef Klauck's what is it called? It looks at epistolary criticism, and this is a great book, by the way. In fact, his other books are great too. So, Ancient Letters in the New Testament: A Guide to Context and Exegesis. It is a great book. I mean, it is hefty, and he does rhetoric and epistolary stuff. I would have to review how he might handle Thanksgivings and if he does much with it. I'm pretty sure that there would be a general understanding that such Thanksgiving establishes goodwill. I mean, that's a no-brainer, which is part of what you do at the beginning of a speech. But how they might relate that further in terms of content of the letters, I'm not aware of studies, but maybe that exists. His book, The Religious Context of Early Christianity. I use this for my Roman Hellenism course, which is often a lot of doctoral students take that. Great, great research there. It's not like I agree with everything that he does, but a great scholar. Uh, okay, so I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers. Okay, brethren and cistern, no, or siblings, we could say. I don't want you to be ignorant. It's a formulaic thing. I think it introduces narrative. It also is a meta comment. So a meta comment. Now, what is a meta comment? A meta comment is a technical term to describe when an author is self-reflexive of the communicative act, when the author is talking about talking to the audience. Now, I would want to extend meta comments to not just the act of communication from the author's perspective, but also from the reception perspective of the audience. And I would even posit that we could talk about a situational meta comments, which narrative material might be a little bit about. So basically, meta means it's above the discourse. So you're kind of talking about the discourse and its reception. And that's what Paul is doing here. He could have just said, he didn't even need this statement, right? He didn't need to say, I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren. He could have just said, oftentimes I've wanted to come to you. Okay. He doesn't. He sets it up with, I don't want you to be ignorant. And so that's what these meta comments do is they tee up what follows in a particular way. They provide kind of an orientation towards tone and attitude of the author towards the discourse. Sometimes it can be a happy tone, sometimes it can be a warning tone. So yeah, pay attention to these meta comments. They set off what follows as particularly important. And in this case, we get the important content in this OT clause. So this OT clause is a OT is indeed a connector. It's giving us the content of what Paul wants them not to be ignorant of. Okay. And basically, oftentimes, polakis, there's an adverb, polakis, I determined to come to you. Now, this determining to come is probably a purpose. This is a purpose statement. So this is a verb. It's a me verb. It's an aorist tense for singular. It's middle form me verbs. I've intended to come to you. So this is a type of purpose clause with a verb of intention with motion. I've intended, I've determined to come to you. And I think that this is kind of interesting too, because pros humas is basically functioning like an indirect object, which typically we would think of as the dative case. So I'd have to look at how often elthine, the verb, this is from erkome, I come or I go, how often it takes the dative case to come to you, or is it always taking pros? I mean, are there other options? I mean, you could have used is, the preposition is, but that would have more of an into sense. So yeah, what are the options of this verb and why is pros here? And I think pros it marks closeness, coming to the point of in terms of being close. So I think that that's probably intentional, but I'd want to study that a little bit more. Like, in other words, what's the construal there in the construction options? And I want to come to you and was inhibited, was inhibited. This is from the verb kaluo, to impede or forbid. So it's kind of an interesting verb. It does show up elsewhere in Paul's writing. It's not like a high frequency verb, but to hinder, prevent. Yeah, and so it can actually mean forbid. I'm getting the idea of impeded because it's aorist passive. So it's an aorist passive. We see the augment. Um, I've been impeded until now. I've been impeded Acri Acri Devro. And why Devro? Why not noon? What's the difference? Why use Devro here until now? So yeah, it's kind of an interesting word. It's a choice until this present time. Yeah, so I'm a little bit curious about the use of Devro as opposed to noon, which means now. Okay. Now, continuing on here, and then we'll stop for some questions. In order that, so here's another layer of purpose. Ina indicates purpose. Some gift, direct object, I might have. This is from Echo. This is a hard form. That's from Echo. It's a subjunctive form. That's quite a stem change. So Echo to SCO. Yeah, so that I might have some fruit even among you, just as also in all the nations, among all the nations. So I might have some fruit also among you, just as also among the nations. Well, what kind of fruit are we talking about? I think it's harvest fruit. He's using a metaphor, obviously, just like the passage from Matthew 9 I mentioned earlier. The Lord of the harvest wants to send out laborers. The harvest is ready. And so Paul wants some fruit also among you as in the rest of the nations. So he's declaring that he's been eager to come to Rome. He's been prevented until now, and that his purpose to come has a expressed purpose, ina, with the subjunctive. So ina with the subjunctive indicates a goal here, in order that I might have some fruit. Yeah. And this fruit corresponds with other fruit that he's had elsewhere. And so here there is a closing of three layers of subordinate clauses. You got the content clause of determined to come, the content of determining to come, which is probably a little purpose idea. Then you have the purpose expressed with ina, which is a default purpose statement. And then you have a kathos clause. And kathos clauses are kind of tricky because they're often verbless. So you just have to supply the verb from the previous context. So just as I've also had fruit, so I've had fruit uh, as in the rest of the nations. So yeah, kathos clauses. So you actually have at the end here three layers of subordinate clauses ending. That's what these brackets are doing. So my marking method, I use brackets. And really, we could have gone back to the start of all of this, which is, and I'll call that 0, just because I used up all my numbers. So the start of it all is the content that Paul does not want them to be ignorant about. All right, so let me pause there if you have any questions. The word Gentiles is the word nations, by the way, and nations may be a better word. Peoples might also, or ethnic groups might actually be a better word because we know that the Romans and presumably others thought of ethne in terms of like regional ethnicities, like almost like nationalities, but more geographically understood. So you had statues of these personified people groups in Roman victory art and other kind of settings. You had people groups represented by women. They were personified as women, by the way, and you could recognize them by the inscription. You know, the ethne, the Dacian ethne, the Britannia ethne, the whatever Judean ethne by how they dressed, kind of if they had some kind of head covering, also the kind of dress that they had on, the kind of garb. So yeah, we're talking here kind of like a nationality group that is regional, but then they might be spread around, but they're still recognizable. Now, this world was kind of very aware of these distinctions. I was in the city of where in Asia Minor, it'll come to me which city it was, but on the forum, in preparation for parades, inscribed on the ground where were ethnic designations, where people who were getting ready to parade uh, got ready to do the marching, and it was by ethnic group. So yeah, people had a lot of pride in their nationality, and not unlike today, not unlike today. All right. Well, any questions with verse
Yeah,
13?
Dr. Long, I wanted to, I didn't quite catch exactly what you said in the beginning about agnoin, but it does seem interesting to me that, Paul is rhetorically setting up and ingratiating himself to his audience via
Mm.
he's being very thoughtful about it. And
Yeah.
so as you say, he could have said like, I just want you to know that I want to give you this gift. But saying, I don't want you to be ignorant that I want to give you this
Yes.
gift
Yeah.
is just a little bit more of a rhetorical pitch into
Yeah.
like, um, it just makes the deal a little bit different for them. Like, oh, I want you not to be, well, of course I don't want to be ignorant. Yeah, tell me. Oh, I'm going to give you this gift. It just creates a little bit more of that rhetorical goodwill coming into this.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It is a litotes, so there is a little bit of a uh, rhetoricalness to it, the way that it's indicated. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I agree. And it's intriguing. I have to go back and look at Quintilian's, use of that formula, what he's intending by that. But yeah. By the way, here's some reliefs from Aphrodisias, which is in Asia Minor. So this shows Emperor Claudius defeating Britannia. This is Britannia personified as a woman. So this is part of victory art that's found there. Here's another conquered person. This is the Roman people. This might be the goddess Roma, or the Senate personified as a woman crowning somebody there. There's another brutal picture here of this is Armenia. So this is Nero, we know, with victory art, and this is Armenia. You can tell by her headdress. So this kind of stuff is really fascinating. I have a whole essay where I look at this kind of thing, and so yeah. All right, let's keep going. Now, verse 14, there's a syndeton. So a syndeton is when you have no connector. So you're having there's no connector the between the sentences. So now the te and the ke, this te is working with the ke. So this is not the connector between sentences. So this means that we have a syndeton. And a syndeton, one of the functions can be for to indicate some kind of a break. Now, I think that's important because of that we do have a little bit of a break here. And the we also then have like a formulaic expressions, and you have me statements. So I am an obligator. So this is how I would diagram this. I am an obligator. I'm an ob I have a debt. I have a debt, and he's coordinating two types of people to which he is a debtor. Uh, and this tech is a nice way to say both and. You could have used ke, ke, But teke is a post positive, so it's going to be located after what it's coordinating with the next thing. And so there is kind of a nice you can hear it in the Greek, teke. And this is why Erasmian pronunciation is problematic. It would be tekai, tekai. But in fact, the te and ke have a nice rhyming. We know that the alpha iota was pronounced as an epsilon. So teke, teke. Greeks and barbarians. He's obligated to Greeks and barbarians, both the wise and the foolish. Okay. Well, what is that about? What does it mean for Paul to be a debtor? It's a big question. A debtor in what way? Ophelites. This is a predicate nominative working with emi. This is pretty existential. I am. Paul is defining who he is. I have an obligation. I'm a debtor to these two types of people. And there's obviously a parallelism between these two types, Greek and the foolish, the barbarian, and the wise and the foolish. So notice there's been a shift, right? He was talking about the nations having fruit among the nations, but now he's switched to talk about Greeks and then barbarians. And so Greek is to barbarian as wise is to foolish. And so what is the deal with this? Well, designation Greek and barbarian betrays a cultural bias that the Greeks, the ethnic Greeks had against the barbarians. Okay, so in the Greek writings of of the day, the Attic orators and others subsequently, the world was divided into two groups. The Greeks and everyone who is not a Greek was called a barbarian, barbaros. And the word barbaros involves, I think it's called onomatopoeia, where the babbling utterance of a foreigner would be represented by Barbara, 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 Barbara. From their perspective, that's what they sound like. Barbara, 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 Barbara. Well, so that's how the name came about. I believe I'm correct about that. So, so this is an interesting statement because it's a syndeton, so it indicates a break. It shifts from nations, ethne, to uh, uh, Hellene, Greek, and now it's speaking from the vantage point of privileging the Greek, because it's from their cultural framework. There, everyone was Greek, and if they weren't Greek, everyone else was a barbarian. So isn't that interesting? It betrays a cultural bias, and that bias is seen particularly in the next parallel statement, wise and foolish. So the Greeks are the wise ones. The barbarians are thought of as the foolish, the uneducated ones. Okay. And Paul says, I'm obligated to them both. Okay. Now we'll come to that in just a little bit, and we look at how this begins the thesis for the rest of chapter one into maybe chapter two a little bit. Okay, because Paul is going to be talking about the so-called wise who are not wise, and God's turned them over to folly. Okay, and so why is Paul obligated to them? Well, as we get to Romans 1:18 to the end of chapter 1, they're utterly lost, actually. They're befuddled in their thinking. They should be properly praising God and giving thanks to the Creator. Instead, they are worshiping the creation and being handed over because of that. God hands them over in their vices to their devices, and they're corrupted, completely corrupted and lost. They're lost, utterly lost, to the point where we're going to see at the end of chapter 1, that not only do they do such kinds of vices, and these vices, by the way, are thoroughgoing. They involve mind, heart, and body. It is a lost corruption. So not only do they do such things as these, they condone those who do such things as these. It's a sad state of affairs. Why is Paul obligated to them? Because they're lost. They're utterly lost. So 114 is beginning to outline the next steps of the argument. And let me kind of show you what that looks like. Uh, in 114 outlines seeking, professing to be wise, they became fools. There's the word, there's the idea of thinking versus, foolishness. So wise, sophos, they become more moronic. And so the word nous and thinking, which is related to no otes, also shows up in this verse range. So we'll get there in just a moment. Yeah, and we'll look at those a little bit more. So we're beginning to see that 114 is outlining the next section. Now let's go back then and look at verse 15. Now verse 15 is utos to kata eme pro thumon ke umin tis en Rome evangelisteste. Thus, my eagerness, or the eagerness according to me, also to you who are in Rome, to you, the ones in Rome, to preach the gospel. Okay. Now, this is kind of a weird sentence because the it appears to be verbless. We have to supply the verb estin. So this is a noun, eagerness or desire, um, modified by kat and me, which is a weird way of saying like my eagerness. I mean, why not just use mu or emon, the possessive adjective pronoun? So to say a kat eme is more pronounced. It's a construction option. It I think kata is with the accusative often sets a standard. So we're almost getting an understanding that there's an eagerness according to his own internal standards also to preach to you, the ones in Rome. Okay. So it's almost like Paul is very aware of having this obligation to preach to people who are lost, both ethnically, who think that they're superior and call everyone else barbarians, who think that they're wise, but then also to the ignorant. He has this obligation to preach to them. And so this is an eager desire according to his standard, according to this debt that he has. He's a debtor to them. Now, I think it's beautiful to kind of see Paul continue to reflect on this kind of thing in his later letters, where in the pastorals he considers himself the chief of all sinners. And really, if you think about it, I mean, he was murderous. We don't know how many people he murdered. He certainly was approving of the murdering of people. He was eager and zealous to seek them out and bring them in. I mean, Paul was zealous, and for him then to be an example of someone who was lost, and not just lost, but antagonistic towards the church and towards Christ, for the Lord to be able to save him is quite a testimony. Quite a testimony. I mean, he's about as lost as you could be lost, and the Lord can save him. And so he becomes an exemplum, an example for others to follow. And so he has this debt to save people. In fact, he says, I preach the gospel free of charge. I don't want to be paid for it, which is a pretty radical statement and gets him into trouble actually with the Corinthians because when he rejects their patronage, they're trying to support him. He's like, no, I don't receive payment from people I'm ministering to. And then they find out that he's receiving money from the Macedonians when he's ministering elsewhere, and then it gets him into trouble. So hence First, Second Corinthians is a whole interesting set of letters describing kind of his missionary practice. So yeah, I'm really intrigued by this debt that he has. And so he connects it with this desire to come to you who are in Rome to preach the gospel. Now, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, you just said that he's starting the thesis statement, but then verse 15 goes back to verse 13, right? And his plans to come to them and preach the gospel, have some kind of fruit. Well, what's going on here is something that has been described by Bruce Longenecker, The Rhetoric at the Boundaries, the Art and Theology of the New Testament Chain Link Transitions. So here's the cover of the book. Now, a chain link is when you start to interlink content. And so this whole book looks at this phenomenon in ancient literature, looks at it in Jewish, Greek literature, and then looks at examples in the New Testament. He's got a whole chapter dedicated to Romans, but his only examples are, he has like three examples. Romans 7 right here and 8. And indeed, this is a great example of a chain link connection. So what a chain link is where you have text unit A, where it's one kind of content, and then you have uh, a radical switch, it seems like, which is anticipating what comes next. And then you have a return, retrospective look back at content A, and then you have the next unit B. And so that's what we have going on in 114. 114 is looking forward to the thesis development. And then you have this retrospective, thus, that's why I want to come preach the gospel to you. That's going back to the previous verse 13. And then you have the next units, the next material that 114 is related to, the rest of the partition, and then the rest of chapter 1. So in his book on the chapter on Romans, he only speaks about this chain link happening here, chapter 10 and chapter 12. It's a He misses it. He misses seeing it here. But I believe it is here. I believe it is here. And that's why this material seems like it's out of place, is because he's doing this chain link back to verse 13. So this is a verbless clause in a sense. You have an implied "emi." So thus my desire is also to preach the gospel to you. Okay, because he's obligated to all to the Greeks, to the wise and the foolish. Okay, so verse 15 is linking back to his desire to come to them. Verse 13. All right, so this is kind of a hard verse to unpack because it is verbless. We have to supply a verb. The cat here means also to you, and then to you is given apposition or really modification to you, the ones who are in Rome. And then we have this infinitive to preach the gospel. So basically, remember that the word when you have an infinitive, that it can take an accusative subject. So my desire, my eagerness is to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. And if you have to yeah, so that's how I would understand that. Any questions about verse 15?
Would you mind just briefly summarizing that ABAB that you were just talking about, how exactly that's working in this?
Yeah.
Just really quick
So
summarizing that again.
yeah. So the A material is the narrative of Paul's prayer and eagerness to come to Rome. So that was in like was it 1, 8, 8 through or 9 through 13. Okay. Then we have a syndeton, which indicates a break. We have a shift from nations to Greeks and barbarians. This is a shift right here. This is B material, Paul's obligation to wise and foolish. Okay, that's kind of a sudden shift right there. And then the interlocking is then verse 15, which is a return back to Paul's eagerness to come to Rome. And then what we're going to see in the B, so remember that this is anticipatory. And so it anticipates two things, the rest of the partition and chapter one. In other words, he's going to be developing, talking about the wise and the foolish, those who thought they were wise, but in fact, God has made them foolish. Okay, so that's anticipating what's coming in 118 through the 32. And so B is the rest of the partition and chapter one development. So this little weird hiccup here seems to break up a new movement, right? There's a syndeton, a shifting of perspective from nations to talk about Greeks and barbarians, wise and foolish. But in fact, this little break is anticipating the rest of the petition, which is 116 and 17, and to the rest of chapter one, which it prepares for. Chapter one, so 118 to 32, which is the description of the fallen Greek world or the fallen world of the so-called wise. Yeah. So that's how it works there. So you shift from narrative to the start of a partition that's particular about Paul's obligation to speak to the wise who are indeed foolish. And then you have brief return back to Rome. And then then you move into B, what was anticipated, the rest of the partition and the chapter one development. Yeah, so I think this is an example of the chain linking. Yeah. Well, the let's go on to verse 16 then, which pretty universally, if you look at commentaries on Romans, commentators, they will say this is the thesis statement. Okay, so what I'm arguing here is that the thesis statement begins two verses earlier and then is involved in a chain link. This, I think, begins the thesis with a statement of Paul's deep obligation and then return to Rome, and then the partition continues. So this is universally seen as the thesis statement. I think it's a partition that there's particular points that's being outlined. Okay, so here we're going to see that the key wording is Jew and Greek. Okay, so Paul adds to this So basically, this verse is a substantiation of why he's not ashamed of the gospel, and it's going to have a little two layering. So these gar statements are very notable here. So ugar epeskuneme to evangelion dunamis gar theou estin is soterian panti to pesteventi udeo te proton ke eleni. So here you have a specification of not Greek and barbarian, but now you have Jew and Greek. Now, this is the way that the Jews viewed the world from their cultural bias. You had Jews, and then you had the Greeks. Okay, so you have Jew, Greek. You have a Greek added in here. You might say, well, the distinction was between Jew and nations. That may be fair. That may be fair. So you have a merging of cultural perspectives of particularity of a Judean, which was one of the types of ethne, but then they also thought of people in terms of the Greeks, the broader Greek world, the nations. Now, Paul is reserving the nations. His use of the nations in Romans is very specific. The nations, the word ethne, and I can show this to you, particularly when we get into chapter 2, but the use of ethne is potential missionary work for him. Converts to the gospels are coming out of the nations, or this is where the gospel is going into. So it's interesting that he's using the word ethne in a really he wants to link that with the gospel. The gospel is for the ethne. So Paul in this verse, this would be translated gar. So this gar is indicating strengthening, and he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." This is a very existential statement. It's a verb of shame. This is honor shame. Why would he be ashamed of the gospel? Well, there's a lot of shame associated with the gospel, if you think about it. There is the fact that we have Jesus crucified, which is itself a source of shame. We have, we're heralding him as the Messiah, the King, and it's just a shameful kind of thing, potentially. People from the outside are looking at that saying this doesn't make any sense. And so Paul is unabashedly saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Okay, so I'm going to preach to you who are in Rome. I'm not ashamed of this. Okay, even though when I preach this, I'm beaten up, I'm spat upon, I'm imprisoned, I've endured a lot of hurt and shame. I'm not ashamed of this. I'm going to line myself up with this gospel and keep proclaiming it. So, what rationale does Paul give to support this? Well, the next part of the verse, for it is the power of God for salvation. Okay, so another EME statement, another statement of definition. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in this partition is a lot of definition, a lot of ethnic referencing, a lot of Paul's self description. I'm an obligator. I'm not ashamed. And then pointing to God. This is the power. The gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. And this Ponti has quantitative stress. There's quantitative stress. This means that everyone who's believing, starts to enters into the power of God, salvific power of God. Now, I understand power quite and salvation quite comprehensively, past, present, and future. Okay, so the gospel reveals what God has done in the past to save us, Jesus's work on the cross, the grace and the Holy Spirit that comes out of that from Pentecost, and the ongoing being saved from sin. We're slaves to righteousness now. Paul develops that in chapter 5. And now we can also set our minds on the things of the Spirit and walk in the Spirit. chapter 8. So this gospel is the power of God. Now, this idea of power, we need to have a greater appreciation of this in the ancient Mediterranean context. It was a book by Ramsay McMullen that I was reading through that he really went off on this point of power, that in the ancient world, people were eager to connect to divinities and political institutions for the sake of power, to receive tangible power like ability, like an experience. And so people were sacrificing and praying to divinities to receive tangible effects, to experience the power of God. Okay, so this is a bold claim that Paul is making here, that God is in and acts in and through the proclamation of the gospel when met with belief, when there is belief that God is indeed present and people confess and repent before God, there is a power manifestation and such that Paul can write to the Corinthians, when you're all gathered together and prophesying, the unbeliever and uninitiated are going to see this and be convicted in their heart and say, God is truly among you. Now that's amazing. So for Paul to say that the gospel reveals the power of God is speaking to a culture that is seeking for power and wanting connection with the divine and seeking that connection in various ways. Paul says it's found in the gospel and it's unleashed through believing, through trusting in the God behind the message, in and through the message. So yeah, this is quite a statement here. It's a comprehensive statement. How is the gospel the power of God? Um, he's gonna be explaining that and what follows. Now, the this is an inclusive invitation to everyone who is believing. This is a dative. These are the recipients to the power and the salvation that's unleashed. This is a substantive participle from pistevo, a dative singular to every person who believes, and then this is given appositional clarity and specificity by way of the ethnic reference to Jew first, and both Jew first and to Greek. So it doesn't just stop with the Jew, but it also goes to the Greek. Now, how does this relate to the thesis statement? Well, if we look at this expression, Greek first and then Greek Jew first and then Greek, indeed, this expression is found in chapter 2 and in chapter 3. In other words, it's a formula that has a very restricted use just after chapter 1. So the rest of chapter 1 is developing the idea of Paul's obligation to the wise who have indeed become foolish. And so after that, we have Paul talking about his gospel that that is associated with good deeds and the power of the Spirit. And so he starts to talk about that in chapter 2. And so I would argue that verse 16, the first part of verse 16, is indeed going to be elaborated in chapter 2. Why is Paul not ashamed of the gospel? Well, it produces fruit among the nations, among for both Jews and for Greeks. So this phrase shows up, formulaic phrase shows up, and this is one clue that we're also looking at a part of the outline of Romans and the initial statement of Paul's gospel. So here in 3, we have this kind of weird statement that Paul says we have been falsely charged or blasphemed that the gospel that we advocate for sinfulness. So in 3:9, the previous verse, actually we need to look at that. Paul Paul says that we're being falsely accused. Let's do evil that good may come. And Paul says that is not our message at all. So my gospel leads is it has power behind it in that it transforms people for good deeds, for good work. And so we'll look at that more next time as we unpack more of what I think is the thesis statement in what follows 17 in two parts. And then we'll look at verse 18 next week as well. So we'll have to stop it there. Um, yeah, we're getting into the heart of Romans, I would argue. N.T. Wright would say it's chapter 8. I would say it's right here in the middle of chapter 1. So thanks everybody for joining in, and we'll look forward to, I guess there's a couple questions here. Yeah, I think there is a potential problem, a misunderstanding of his gospel. So that's what shows up. If you look at 3:8, Tom, it kind of comes out of nowhere that Paul is being blasphemed, that he's somehow promoting evil, and he's actually not. His gospel condemns sin. I mean, the gospel of God condemns sin, we're going to see, and also saves people to do good. And that's those are two prongs to Paul's gospel that he's clarifying in chapters 1, 2, and 3. Okay. And then he really gets moving in chapter 6 and 8 to talk about the power of walking in the spirit and experiencing life, really living by faith, living differently in this world. Yeah. So he is addressing preemptively, or he's aware of criticism that his gospel somehow is not lawful or does not promote law following, which therefore must mean that he's promoting immorality. Yeah. So this has been plaguing him, and he's addressing that in Romans. He's going to show that one, he upholds the law, or the law, but is good and spiritual and holy. But when met with our human sinful flesh, it's ineffectual. So Jesus comes and unleashes his spirit, and now we're set free from the law of sin and death, and we're able to walk in the newness of the spirit and set our minds on the things of the spirit, which allows us to fulfill the law essentially. If we walk according to the spirit, we fulfill the law. And Paul argues that in Galatians, he argues that in Romans. Yeah. So good questions. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Long.
Thanks, Fred.